Welcome to the FII Regional Summit, Inclusive ESG for Emerging Markets. My name is Edie Lush. I am delighted to be your host today. I have a podcast all about the Sustainable Development Goals, which celebrates the champions who are making the world a better place. And I'm so delighted to look out at the audience and see a group of people who are doing exactly that. And it's so good to see you here in person as well. The pandemic has taken such a toll on us all, but worst of all, in emerging economies and their people. We know that we've been set back by years and we have to get back on track. And such a big part of the solution is here before us at this conference. We can make such a difference by directing more of the growing pool of ESG investment to companies in emerging economies. This will support growth, fairness, and the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we know that all of those goals are so important to achieving the future that we want, but there is one that stands out above all. If we don't address the harmful effects of climate change and limit carbon emissions, none of the other SDGs will be achieved. So today we are going to connect the dots. We're going to tug on the golden thread with the groups of experts and individuals that we're bringing to talk to you. We're going to ask business leaders, CEOs, how they are addressing that funding gap of $5 to $7 trillion needed to achieve the global goals in just 8 years' time. We'll ask how to move more investors over the tipping point to embracing ESG invested, and ask what incentives and information we need to get them there. We will also talk quite deeply about global warming because we know there is no silver bullet to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. But there is silver buckshot, and nothing will be off the table today, including nuclear fusion. We have some big hitters for you all day long, finishing up in our final session with the Egyptian Environment Minister, Senator Matteo Renzi, as well, looking at the road to COP27. So, if we've learned anything from the global climate movement, it's that the voice of young people has to be part of the conversation. We have some phenomenal voices today from Sudan, Argentina, Rwanda. Those voices will continue to remind us of the thread running through today's conversation, connecting the dots, tying them all together, that emerging markets are the growth economies of the future, and they will only receive a small proportion of global ESG funds. So we'll discuss how to channel investments to where we know they need to go. And that brings me to somebody who knows and cares very deeply about these subjects and whose convening power has helped make today happen. Please do give a very warm welcome to the CEO of FII Institute, Richard Atias.
Thank you, Eddie. Thank you very much. Thank you. So, Your Royal Highness, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, welcome to this first FII Regional Summit, and we're so happy and proud to be in London. Thank you yesterday for the fantastic welcome that we had at the London Stock Exchange, and if we had any doubt of how this city is one of the most vibrant cities in the world, definitely now you know how great is London. So we are very happy and proud to be here, and I have to say that my team has prepared a speech, but then I thought, no, let's forget this speech and I will try to speak for the next few minutes with my heart. I'm personally very moved to be here because when we started, I had the privilege to be appointed as CEO of this FI Institute by a royal decree 3 years ago, 2 years and a half. And you know, no one expects to have a not-for-profit foundation born in Saudi Arabia to try to have an impact on humanity. What a mission. But more than ever, I think this mission should be our mission. And thank you all for being here, because you are not just passive participant. Even the format of this room is to make you active participants, to be players, to be really the doers, because the world needs you. I really think the world needs you. And when we started to look at what should be our mission at the FI Institute, we look at 3 arms. The first one is to be the curator of ideas, of great ideas. And we really would like to have you all year long being part of this exchange of ideas. Not only on the 4 pillars that we decided, which are AI and robotics, healthcare, education, and sustainability, but as you see today, we will be addressing the ESG challenges. And I would like to thank our strategic partners who are all in the room. We have more than 20 strategic partners who from day one of the creation of the Institute are on side, because nothing could have been done and would be achieved without them, really. So a round of applause for all our strategic partners, please. So why ESG? I will share with you an anecdote. As you know, FI Institute was known thanks to our flagship event, the FII, the Future Investment Initiative. Already 5th edition. The 6th one will be end of October. And please consider yourself all invited in Riyadh on the 25th, 26th, and 27th of October. I can guarantee you that you will have deep conversation, call to actions. And once again, we try in this era, which I hope post-COVID-19, post-European crisis, to really build together a beautiful world to see how we can invest on humanity, which will be the main theme of our conference. But let's go back to ESG. So 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, I was sitting in the office of our CEO, Rakan Talabzouni, who is here with us today, and I got a call from our chairman, His Excellency Yasser Rumayyan, who is also the governor of the Public Investment Fund, who will be joining us later today, just after the lunch, at 1 p.m., with Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock. And he told me, Richard, I think we should address a new topic at the foundation. I say, yes, which one? Richard, we need to talk about ESG. We need to start to own this conversation about ESG and ESG challenges. And we need to try to see how we can have a more inclusive ESG. It's very important. I say, yes, of course, yes, sir. Great idea. I will make a confession today, a confidence. And I hope Yasser will not be disappointed because I know he's listening to us now. I had no clue what ESG was about. Really, I had no clue. So I thought to Rakan, listen, it seems to be very serious. So went on Google. We tried in 2 hours to become the best expert on ESG. And we realized that, oh my God, this is the next CSR. This is something which was created 15 years ago, even 20 years ago, but no one was talking about it. And for the past 3 years, as you know, ESG became central. And thank you, Elon Musk, for putting, for the past 24 hours, ESG in the center of the debate. Perfect timing to promote this event. So maybe you will be discussing about Elon Musk, I would say, statements for the past 24 hours. He was very active on Twitter, as usual, of course. He has to make noise on Twitter. But anyway, so why it's important? I will not go to detail. You are the best expert. But definitely, when I look at the fact that we need to build a framework on environmental, social, and governance impact, how can we say no? The definition of ESG is exactly online and aligned with the mission of the foundation. Who cares wins. And this is what I would like today to discuss with you. How can we do more to show that we care? We care about the youth. We care about the next generation. We care about the emerging markets because they are the future. In fact, they are the present. When we talk about new frontiers, they are the new frontiers. And I was so touched by this mission that Yasser gave me because I was born in an emerging market. I was born in Morocco, and I know that the 1.2 billion people in Africa, they need you guys. They need you to help them to build the right governance framework, the right inclusive framework. And this is why today, thanks to our partner EY, we will be presenting later this ESG, what I'm calling personally 2.0, which is this new framework, a new scoring methodology. We're not trying to challenge what is existing. We're just trying to bring an additional methodology, which I hope you will adopt, which I hope you will share, which maybe could be a small piece to contribute to build a better world, because it will be much more inclusive. And I'm sure that you will be, like me, supportive of this framework. So we are trying at the Institute to be what? To be a catalyst, to be building bridges. I took that job because as a civil engineer, I was supposed to build bridges. But in fact, my passion, and yesterday, during a small conversation we had with our speakers and our partners, someone said, nothing could happen in the world, nothing, thank you, Noel, without dialogues. We need to dialogue. There is not a single issue in the world which could be solved if we don't build dialogues. You are absolutely right, Noel. And this is why today we are hosting this dialogue. So thank you for being part of this dialogue, and enjoy your conversation. Have a great day. Thank you.
ESG investing has become one of the most important forces in global business today, with ESG assets predicted to reach $53 trillion by 2025. Yet emerging markets receive less than 10% of ESG investment. Emerging markets are where 90% of those under the age of 30 live, and a conversation on the future of ESG cannot happen without them. How can investors support low greenhouse gas emitting initiatives that expand economic opportunity for all? Game-changing technological advancements are accelerating the developed world on a path towards sustainability. How can we ensure that emerging markets won't be left behind? The private financial sector is in a unique position to incentivize the transformation to a more equitable world by agreeing to lend to, invest in, and insure businesses that are best poised to deliver the transition we need. How can we bring the S and the G to the forefront of the global agenda? As we witness a generation that's grown up during a period of seismic changes, who are standing up as climate change and social activists like never before, we see young leaders with a passion to create real change. How can we educate and empower the next generation to promote ESG initiatives? As a global non-profit foundation built upon ESG principles, the FII Institute has been tackling the issue of inclusivity in ESG since its inception through its platforms.
You cannot treat companies who are doing good for the environment like companies who are given no regards whatsoever to the environment.
Thought leadership.
I think we need a new definition of success.
And investment.
We do take the ESG very serious in Saudi Arabia, and especially within PIFs.
We are gathered here today for a series of conversations around one of the most urgent topics for the future of humanity: inclusive ESG. Welcome to the FII Regional Summit.
Richard mentioned dialogue and conversations and how important they are. We're going to get the first one to you right now. Please do welcome the moderator, Etna Trainer, to the stage. Etna, how are you today?
Hello there, how are you doing? Great to be here.
Good to be
and
here.
So lovely to be here with you all. And again, I love the full disclosure from Richard. And a lot of people actually say the same thing when we ask them that question. They're like, ESG?
Well, it's amazing because the numbers are large, Etna. To achieve the SDGs by 2030, 5 to 7 trillion a year has to be deployed. This needs to be done by business, right?
It needs to be done by business. And again, I think I'm very excited to see the business community just owning this. I think this is so important. Remember, as a journalist, when we were, doing the streets of London and, falling over CSR companies and saying, the CEO wants to talk about this, and you're like, yeah. Right. But now I think the ownership sits with the CEOs, and this is just what's really going to move this, and it is.
Great. Well, take it away.
It's so powerful.
Fantastic.
Hey, thank
See
you
you
so
soon.
much. And again, this is really all about leveraging the power of the capital markets. The power is in this room. It's with your colleagues. It's with everybody who knows how to do this. And we're pretty much ready to go. So let me invite my panel up here. We're really going to get into this conversation. We have so much to talk about. And joining us from HSBC, we have the Group Chief Executive, Noel Quinn, is joining us. From the London Stock Exchange Group. So Noel, we'll put you here. Cameras are there. From the London Stock Exchange Group, the CEO, David Schwimmer, joins us. Rishi Kapoor, the co-CEO at InvestCorp. Howell Ball is with us. He's a UK chair for UK and Ireland, managing partner with Ernst & Young. EY is here. And Bob Welch joins us. Bob, of course, the CEO from Modern. You're going to hear a lot about Modern. For anyone who doesn't know about it, you're going to be beyond impressed. So we don't have a lot of time, and we have a lot to talk about. So, Noel, if I might start with you, looking at ESG, looking specifically in terms of how we're going to advance progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals as well. Put it in sort of perspective in terms of what global corporations and the financial community can actually do.
Well, let me look at it from my perspective in HSBC, and we made a statement about 2 years ago, particularly on the sustainability aspect. And if you think about the 156 years worth of history of HSBC, we financed today's industrial base. That's what we've done. We finance the manufacturing base in Asia. We finance the Middle East and all of the oil and gas and the energy sector in the Middle East. We finance the industrial build-out that's taking place across Europe and the US. That's what we've done. So what I now want to do is to help that industrial base go through the next revolution, go through the next retooling of how industry serves the world and serves community. I don't want to walk away from that challenge. I want to walk into it. And for that reason, we said that we want to be a market leader in financing the transition from today's industrial base to the industrial base of tomorrow, which is lower carbon intensive, more environmentally sustainable, but also serving the needs of communities. And it has to be a just transition.
And we're going to talk a lot more about that, David. We look at the work of the London Stock Exchange Group and also all the companies, that you represent. One of the areas, and you're really adamant about this, I think you're asking for it, but also maybe nudging, in terms of full disclosure. This, more than anything else, you say has to happen before we can actually move forward. Tell us about that.
Well, you started this panel by saying we don't have a lot of time. That applies to this situation. And as the world is trying to address the transition that Noel's talking about, move from a carbonized economy to a decarbonized economy, we do not have a lot of time. And there's a real urgency here. We could talk about tipping points and various other aspects, but just to get right into it, our role as an exchange, we are an issuance venue. We are a platform that helps issuers raise capital, helps capital providers allocate that capital. And there's an enormous need for trillions of pick your currency to be reallocated to form this transition and to drive this transition. So that's a big part of our role as an exchange. Another part of our role as an exchange in the London Stock Exchange Group, we are, by definition, we're an intermediary. We spend a lot of time with issuers, trying to help them understand what is going on here in the transformation. Richard talked about not knowing what ESG was a couple of years ago. A lot of issuers are having to adjust to a dramatically changed environment. And we are trying to help them realize that their approach to sustainability has a big impact on their cost of capital. The other side of the equation is the investors, the allocators of that capital. And we also work with them in terms of helping them understand this is a whole new burden on the market. It's a whole new burden on the issuers out there. There's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of confusion. We're trying to help them simplify that. And I would say the third aspect of this in terms of our role is to help the market get to a place where we have more standardized data and standardized disclosure. We can talk a little bit more about that, but that's a critical element in terms of getting the markets to the right place.
Absolutely, and also I think it's quite frustrating for many people because maybe we need a little more standardization within that. Now, talking about allocating capital, Rishi, you often talk about this and say, you know, how investment companies like yourself, you know, you have a privileged position in so many ways in terms of allocating that capital. You know, are companies doing the right thing, and what do we really need to make sure that we're doing? And maybe do it a bit faster. I think we're also hearing a bit of an urgency to it.
Well, the theme of urgency is coming out loud and clear, Etna. But I'm going to start off by being a little provocative. I saw one of the taglines on the screen earlier. It said ESG investing. In my humble opinion, that's the past. Investing is what we are talking about. All investing has to incorporate ESG into it. Just like we say that investment is for the purpose of delivering return in a risk-adjusted fashion, well, guess what? One of those considerations has got to be to build in ESG into the framework of the primary purpose behind investments. I'm fond of saying, you know, making a statement, at least in coffee chats, let your capital speak for you, right? We at InvestCorp, we are the shepherds of capital. Ultimately, that capital belongs to individuals, you know, like all of us in this room. It's savings channeled through pension plans, sovereign wealth funds, even high net worth investors, etc. And what are those savings for? They are there to protect and enrich the lives of future generations, right? And what kind of protection and enrichment are we going to provide if that capital is not producing a fair, a reasonable, an inclusive, and a habitable world, right? So this is not about ESG investing. This is about thinking about what investing really means and making sure, much like what we do at InvestCorp, that it is part and parcel of your culture. When you invest, think about ESG in the same way that you think about risk and return.
And I think it's so healthy that we're actually beginning to see that shift. You know, this, Howell, stay with us here, leads me on really, that I mentioned earlier, the CEOs have taken charge of this. And this, I think, is just so very important. You work with CEOs around the world. You know, we look at the shift, I suppose, in terms of who owns this. How much of a difference is that making now that you can see?
I think it's been the acceleration over the last few years has just been phenomenal. There was a great quote like Henri Ford said that the sustainability revolution is going to have the size of the industrial revolution and the speed of the digital revolution. And EY can trace our history back to 1828 in Glasgow with Arthur McClelland. And he was there to start with new founders of capital to drive the industrial revolution. As Noel, I was thinking when you were talking, Noel, about the 150 years of banking, our job as accountants over that period has been to provide confidence to the capital markets. And then as that accelerated then in the 20s with the limited liability coming. And now I'm thinking this new sustainability revolution, the advice that we're getting asked by chief executives, help me now on that transition. How do I provide comfort on the disclosures that's going to be needed for the investors, for the bankers, for that aspect? And that speed has just been phenomenal.
And Bob, we have all the key money players around here, but you're practically out there day to day, you know, running a business, and a business that sometimes maybe has a different reputation depending on who you're talking to. You're in the extractive industries, and you're also looking at great expansion, and you're looking at great exploration. So how do you do that, almost a two-tier plan, so to speak, in terms of making sure that you're doing that on one side and also building sustainability into it?
Is exactly correct. It's not only ESG investing, there's not a separate ESG investing. There's also not a separate way of incorporating ESG into our business like minerals and mining. We are going to find the metals and the minerals that are going to decarbonize the world, but we're also going to do it in a way that elevates humanity at the same time. Most of the minerals that are going to lead the decarbonization revolution are in emerging markets. And those same emerging markets who arguably have been exploited in the past are not going to tolerate it in the future. And we as an industry realize that, and we as a company want to be at the forefront of being the role model on how to do it. But it's not a separate department, it's not a separate function, it's not a separate conversation. It's embedded in everything we do, from the board level all the way to the operators.
Rishi, let me just come to you. You know, when we look at funds and allocation, there's lots of funds that have actually very publicly said, you're not getting our money. So, I mean, when we look at what needs to be done, I think particularly in the short term, I would say perhaps that decarbonization is probably one of the most important things to do. And, you know, that's an area that probably needs a little bit more funding right now. What do you think?
100%. And let me actually pick up on that. I think this whole idea of exclusion, you know, having exclusion lists, etc., it's a really blunt instrument, right? It's much more about figuring out how you can help businesses and consumers on their journey towards a lower carbon footprint when we are talking about the environment, towards a more inclusive setup, you know, society when we are talking about social inclusion and governance, etc. Now, you know, we at InvestCorp, annually, we run a survey with our investors, trying to identify what is top of mind for them as they think about the next 3 decades. Not the next 3 months, not the next 3 years, the next 3 decades. And the top 3 trends that they identify and have consistently identified over the last couple of years have been, not surprisingly, AI, aging population, and climate change. I think one of the biggest opportunities in the next several years for investing and generating return is going to stem from decarbonization. The development of innovative technologies that will help companies like Martin, that will help companies that otherwise may be on that so-called exclusion list, to provide an essential product or service that is needed by the world, but in a manner that is sustainable, right? That is what we are in the business of doing, not just simply saying, okay, no, you're shut out, you'll get my capital. That's just a very blunt.
And I talk to a lot of CEOs in the energy sector, and I think, you know, there's a frustration among them in terms of, yes, we're all focused in the one direction, but how are we going to get there? Noel, if I might talk to you about this. I mean, we hear a lot about green finance, but there's also probably a big need, and even as Rishi is saying, for more transition finance. And are we beginning to see that? Because it sounds like the narrative is beginning to get possibly a little bit more sensible.
Yes, which is basically
the world at the moment is very binary. Green is good, brown is bad. And you have to choose between those two extremes. And I firmly do not believe in that proposition. There are some projects out there and some businesses out there that are pure green businesses. That's fine, we'll finance them. But we have to put even more finance into those businesses that are on a transition journey, that they're modifying their current business model, their current technology base, their current operations, from where it is today with its current carbon footprint, over the next 30 years, to a more sustainable carbon footprint going forward. And that's going to require huge investment. And therefore, as a CEO of a PLC, where there are lots of commentators saying you have to choose, walk away from brown, walk into green, I'm saying, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to actually finance that transition, that journey, from where we are to where we want to be. That industrial revolution needs capital. We're a provider of capital. That has to happen in a space of time like we haven't seen before. There is no time to have a binary world. We have to have a world that transitions.
And again, I think we have a lot of work to do on perhaps the public relations image on that. Howell, if I keep you on this one at the moment, and particularly, you know, Bob talked about the extractive industry predominantly in emerging markets. It's very different in emerging markets when we look at what needs to be done. How can we, you know, I suppose, approach investment in emerging markets? Because we can't do it with the same lens as in the developed market. What do you think?
No, I totally agree. I mean, I was involved 5 years ago in a project for inclusive capitalism called the Embankment Project, which was talking about how stakeholders will measure companies. And it was very much a developed companies with developed investment funds and developed pension funds looking at the value chain across that. At the time, we thought this is going to be very different in emerging markets, and that was why we were so excited about the opportunity to work with the Future Investment Initiative on new metrics for emerging markets, because you have to have a different lens. An example I bring is health and safety. Most ESG metrics will look at health and safety about the control framework they have. Actually, in emerging markets, it's more about how you're working with your supply chain. What is the output? What is the safety output of the work that you're doing? And that's more important than your control framework itself.
Come in on this one. Forgive me, I'm having a little technical problem. We look at, you talk about disclosure and you talk about companies, and there are a lot of people out there who are not particularly interested in funds, looking at when there is going to be disclosure. I recently talked to somebody who said that if you're looking at a gas and oil field right now, if you actually say it's gas with associated oil, you might get investment. But if you say it's oil with associated gas, it's the oil where it's a bad one. But how are you looking at companies, and what can you do to actually make sure that this is a more realistic and inclusive conversation right now?
So just to pick up on some of Noel's comments, we have to engage with the companies that are making the transition. And it does not make sense, in many ways, in sort of the early days, if I can put it that way, of ESG investing. There was a lot of portfolio greening, but that in and of itself does not help address the issues. We've got 80% of the world's economy relying on fossil fuels. We can't just flick that off, turn a switch. This will be a transition that will take decades. And so working with companies in extractive resources, oil and gas, metals and mining, has to be the solution. And one of the things that I'm working on, I'm co-chairing the work stream at GFANZ, Glasgow Financial Alliance on Net Zero, for real economy transition plans. So what that means is financial institutions like Knowles, like the London Stock Exchange Group, working together, coming up with guidance for real economy companies, particularly those in high carbon emitting sectors, aviation, steel, oil and gas, as to what the financiers and the markets need from those companies in terms of making transition plans. So providing that helpful guidance. We're putting the report out in September, so there will be that kind of clarity coming then. But that's one example of what we can do to work with the high carbon emitting companies to help make that transition.
And that's very encouraging. Noel, you want to come in here?
Yeah. Listen, I think there's a new feature of corporate governance that's emerging. We all talk about our annual operating plans. We all talk about our 3- and 5-year strategic plans. You're going to have a new pillar to corporate governance, which is your 20, 30-year transition plan. And that is going to be a piece of disclosure that the public markets will require and the private markets will require. The more that you can describe the journey of your company and your business and your technological base over the next 10 to 20 to 30 years, the more likely is you're going to have access to the financial markets. And that also, from a bank's point of view, look, my Scope 3 emissions are all of the emissions of my clients. I need to be able to describe the emissions of my clients to my investors and my regulators, and to make sure that we are able to provide an effective cost of capital to my clients. The more I can talk on your behalf as an industry, the more I have the ability to continue to communicate to my stakeholders. And every other bank CEO is going to be in the same position. Every other pension fund is going to be in the same position. The more you can tell your story as an industry, the more then the financial services sector can support the investment profile of that industry.
And Bob, this must be encouraging
very
to hear. Also, I think, we've talked before, and as you said, this is very much part of your license to operate, right, basically. And I think, again, we look at responsible companies doing the right thing. So you're not going to, you're being watched and you're watching yourself. I think that's important as well.
I think this has been a very encouraging 20 minutes of my life as we talk about the transition. And we've got a very ambitious goal, like many companies do, to be carbon neutral by 2050. And I can point to how to get there about 60% of the way in this very short time period. But to attract capital, I fully expect to be held accountable by financiers on, okay, how are you going to get those licenses? Well, to get the licenses, you have to be a responsible actor in emerging markets, treating people well, an employer of choice. So as we all make this transition, the companies that can demonstrate that they're serious about making the transition and have demonstrated capability and track records of success, even they might not know how to get there, are going to be a lot more apt to be able to attract the capital needed to make the transition.
And, you know, I think, again, we look at the industry, and I think sometimes the extractive industries and hydrocarbon industries have been treated like, they've been treated like the bad child.
Right.
You did bad, you go in the corner, and everybody wants to talk about how bad you did,
Yep.
instead of saying, okay, people have taken this on board, they're actually doing something about it, so now it's about coming together and moving this on. Rishi, stay with us on this here in terms of, you know, how do you actually choose where to invest? And again, I think it is about looking at emerging markets. It's very different. Where do you make, you know, the decisions there, and how do you make them?
Well, so one of the things that I'm actually very bullish about as it comes to this whole idea of embedding ESG into your investment ethos is the fact that I think private capital is going to lead the way on that front. Because we have the benefit, InvestCorp has been doing private investing, only private investing for 40 years. We have the benefit of two things. One is typically we have significant influence, if not outright control, on the underlying investments that we make. And two, we have the benefit of a long-term horizon, right? Typically 5 years, sometimes even longer than that. That allows us to, in turn, work with the underlying management teams of the companies with a solution mindset and the mindset of transition or journey that we've been all talking about during this discussion, rather than trying to greenwash, you know, the outcomes or, you know, just focus on reporting and monitoring as opposed to actual action. So when it comes to how we approach our own investing activity, it's a very different process from one size fits all, to be very precise, right? There is no one size fits all. Between regions, between industries, between companies, and between asset classes. What we've done at InvestCorp is we've developed our own proprietary framework, borrowing pretty heavily from the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board and the UNPRI, which tries to make it a little bit more fit for purpose. In the emerging markets, for instance, we invest heavily in the Middle East, we invest heavily in India. We know that a focus purely on the environment alone is not going to be sufficient, right? In India, for instance, we focus equally, if not more, on the S part of ESG, because ethical procurement, sustainable labor practices, training and development, lives and livelihood, employability, has a much bigger bearing on a market like India than just simply focusing on renewable power generation. I'm not suggesting that's not, you know, needed, but I'm saying there is a very significant element of our investing activity, for example, in emerging markets, that focuses on the S and the G part. In the US, similarly, inclusion and diversity is a very big thing, Etna. You know, we might take it for granted sitting in this room with 40, 50 nationalities represented around the hall. But in the US, you know, I'm proud. We are amongst the first ones in the US to establish and launch a platform specifically focused on seeding and developing asset managers from diverse backgrounds. That's a thing. Imagine, you know, in a deep market like the US. So it's very, you know, kind of fit for purpose, developed and tailored, depending on the asset class and the market.
And I think you're all going to want to talk about that. Howell, start this one off for me. It's not just the E. You have to pay attention to S and G. And how are people doing it? Are they doing it right, and are they doing it fast enough?
The focus is at the moment all on the E. And I think about it as climate is the tip of the spear at the moment to do it. But we are going to move very quickly into the broader S and Gs. And we made a joke, Richard made a joke earlier about Elon Musk, you know, and that's an example, I think, of those changes. So we do have to think in the broader aspect. And the way I look at it is you need to understand what your stakeholders want and what your stakeholders value. And they will vary by community and by country or within that local context. And having that analysis, you need to think about that. The transition plans are fantastic, but they've got to be careful they're not a tick box exercise, and that these are integrated in the strategy for delivering long-term value to organization stakeholders. And if we don't get that right, we're going to risk losing both the climate and the sustainability agenda.
Noel, you've been, your leadership role, particularly in breakthrough with the founder Bill Gates on this too. And as he said, no country, company or individual can halt the progress of climate change alone. And again, that it has to be widened into ESG. It takes, everybody. It takes private, public, everyone has to be involved in this conversation, and everybody has to be involved in the action to make it happen. Talk to us a bit more about that.
Listen, we're all going through a massive learning curve, and we don't have all the answers. Those transition plans will not have the answers for the final 10 years of the next 30 years. They'll have guidance, they'll have direction. Innovation is going to be the lead. Technological innovation is going to be the way to solve the problem of climate. And there's going to be innovation that needs to be scaled, and there's innovation that needs to be proven. And what the Breakthrough Energy is doing is really trying to bring technologies that are well developed and pretty close to being proven to bring them to scale. Because having a great technology but you don't have scale is no good. And what we're doing, we've gone in as an equity provider. We want to learn through that process. I'm going through a personal learning over the last 2 years at a huge rate of knots. We'll make mistakes. Our people, I've got 200,000 people I'm having to re-skill. They've known industries the way they've been run for the past 156 years. They need to learn about the industries that are on the horizon and the business models that are not yet proven, because they need to be able to lend into the future, not just continue lending into the past. And that's a huge reskilling exercise. And frankly, we're involved in that foundation because we want to learn. I want to learn. My team does. And it's a great way to learn.
And I think that's, for everybody in this room. And it's a bit uncomfortable at times, but I think there's no way back.
Life has been uncomfortable the last 2 years, yeah.
Bob, and also when we look at what's going on in Saudi Arabia, I mean, there's such a huge social change. I mean, having looked back when I was there maybe 10, even 5 years ago, to see what it is today, and for people who, haven't been there, or haven't been there for a while, it's a whole different country, and it's got a big focus. And also, in an industry like yours, you're bringing new people in, different people. I see the amount of young women that are in engineering university there, careers that just were not there before. I mean, how do you bring... You almost have a double challenge on your hands to make sure that you're incorporating the E, the S, and the G.
Well, let me go back to one thing real quickly. We're talking about discomfort, and the one size doesn't fit all. And we're looking at communities and jurisdictions where we want to mine globally and within the kingdom. We've gone from, here's the number of jobs and economic opportunity we can provide, and we'll do no harm to your landscape when we're done. That was the old model. The new model is, how many decision-making rights do we allocate to the communities and how we operate our mines and plants? That's craziness for a guy my age, but that's what's required. Back in your question about the excitement of what's going on in Saudi Arabia, I first was in Saudi Arabia in 1991 with the U.S. Army. And the debate when we were deploying to the kingdom was, should we be able to take pictures of our wives and girlfriends with us without offending our hosts?
Not your girlfriends at that time.
Yeah, and it was probably American immaturity as much as Saudi censorship. But that was a debate before we deployed. I was out with my wife in Riyadh this week in a chic sushi restaurant that would rival anything in London or New York or LA. My wife was amazed at the fashionable abayas, the excitement was going on. We made the reservations online, we paid online. It's a totally digital economy. It's vibrant. The good news is, though, the Saudis are not losing their fundamental faith, their values in their family. And how to bottle all of that up and become an employer of choice for young Saudis is one of the most exciting parts of this job. So that's, harness the energy of the youth of Saudi, the diversity, the gender equality movement, and applying that to solving these big, hairy issues that face the globe and the kingdom. It's tremendous.
Yeah, it is. It's an exciting time, but again, frustrating at times, nervous. It's got it all there. And we're in an exciting sort of rush to the finish here. So, David, in terms of, I want a sort of a bit of a call to action with you. Can please comment just in terms of the culture shift that your companies need, that everybody needs, but also perhaps leave us with a bit of a call to action in terms of what companies really can do, real practical steps.
So it's interesting. This is basically a private sector panel here. And I do want to inject into the discussion the policymakers, the governments. And while we've made a lot of progress and a lot has been pushed along with private sector focus, GFANZ and other organizations, Transition Pathway Initiative, Climate Action 100+, we do need policy. We do need government action. And I touched earlier on data and disclosure. London Stock Exchange Group a week or so ago put out a call for action, as you say, in terms of governments around the world putting in place framework for disclosure around emissions. Aligned with the work that's being done by the ISSB, it needs to be economy-wide. It can't be just public companies, it has to include private companies. We have also called for governments to put in place mandatory climate transition plans. And we also think governments need to put in place requirements that companies disclose the allocation of green and non-green revenues. So all important areas in terms of disclosure. And there's a separate big topic out there just in terms of pricing of carbon.
And I wish we could get into that one. That would start a whole new conversation. Yeah. Rishi, stay with us. We have the 30-second big call to action. What would you say, in terms of capital allocation to your colleagues?
Let your capital do the talking. I started with that. I'm going to finish with that.
Again, and I think that's very, very clear. Bob, again, what do you look at when we're, what do you want from investors as well? And what do you see that the public-private sector can actually make life, easier, but make it a win-win?
Well, I applaud your optimism that the government's going to help, but we can't even agree on who was the rightfully elected president of the United States 2 years into his term. I'm afraid it's going to be up to business to drive this change. And I want to attract capital. I want capital to come to those of us who are making the transition responsibly with a demonstrated track record of success and commitment.
Well said there. Howell, again, you have many different clients. What can you tell them, and how can we all move, I suppose, a little bit more comfortably on this journey?
Yeah, we've talked quite a bit about the Industrial Revolution, the comparison to the Sustainable Revolution, and how long that Industrial Revolution has taken. We've developed accounting disclosures frameworks over 150 years. We can't wait 150 years to get the sustainable frameworks that David's been talking about, the disclosure frameworks. And that's why I was so excited by the ISSB. But we're all going to have to work differently. And it's going to have to require brave steps, collaborative steps. And we're going to make some mistakes, but we've got to start experimenting very quickly because we don't have 150 years.
Can I add one thing?
Quickly, yes, please.
On that in particular, I said earlier I'm very bullish about the role that private equity, private capital can play on this front in this journey. I actually do think, however, that when it comes to standardization and disclosures, that's where the public equities and public companies will inevitably have to take the lead, right? It's not just policymakers and governments. The large public corporates, the S&P 500, the Fortune 500, they are going to have to drive the standardization because private capital can only follow on that front.
And we're going to hear so much throughout the day, on all of these points. Noel, I'm going to leave you the closing word here because, there's a lot of money available there, and how are we going to make sure that we get access to these funds?
A couple of quick comments. First, move off of ambition into defining the journey. So don't talk about ambition anymore. Talk more about the journey that you're all going to be on and define that journey well, with detail. Second, I think is be brave. We're all CEOs, we're all leaders of businesses. You're not going to do this by consensus. There are going to be competing voices, and you're going to hear them all, and they conflict. And you've got to be brave, and you've got to have an opinion on where you want to be. Disclose it well, explain it well, but be brave. Third, I think there is a role for government, and there's a little bit of frustration. It's probably why I'll never be a politician. I said at the G7 preparation to some ministers and leaders, I said, one sentence in a communique from you collectively can create a new market. A demand signal can be written in one sentence. And that, for the aviation industry, was sustainable aviation fuel, 10% fuel mix by 2030. One sentence can create a market. That demand signal then creates the supply of finance. not all policy requires money. Some policy requires sentiment.
And I think it also requires great leadership. We're going to have to leave it there, gentlemen. Thank you all so much, really. Noel, David, thank you. Richie, thank you so much. Howell and Bob.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. And what a great panel to actually start off our session here. And again, I think words of caution, encouragement there coming from Noel there. Be brave, all of you. You have to take that chance. You actually at times have to take a risk as well, because there's so much to play for right now, so much going on in the industry, and so much that you absolutely positively have to do. I think we heard from just about everybody there really, really committed to this journey, and again, about defining what that journey is. I think without a doubt, we all know where we're going. But unfortunately, I think the conversation probably has been focused on where we're going rather than how we're going to get there. And I think now we're seeing a bit of realism come back into that conversation. The narrative is definitely shifting. We have more voices on board. And hopefully we'll actually put a little bit more thought process into how we're going to get there and make sure that it is a win-win for everybody. I believe we're ready for our next session. So let me get our panel members up here. Investor-tested strategies by doing well, by doing good, also in search of alpha. So I'm going to be joined online here, or online and in person. How nice to say that. The Global Head of ESG for Invesco, Catherine DeConnick-Lopez. Lovely to see you. I believe we're going to put you over here. Bertie Whitehead is with us, and Bertie, the Managing Director for UK Investment Banking at Goldman Sachs. Bertie's in my chair. What on earth will I do? Shocking, shocking, shocking. And wonderful also to have Oliver Phillips from Standard Chartered Bank here, Sustainable Finance Director. Again, we're going to continue the conversation, probably a little bit about what you heard. And I hope you're very encouraged in terms of what you did hear. And Catherine, perhaps if I might start with you, doing well by doing good. The search for alpha, there's many interpretations on this. How does Invesco look at the ESG value creation particularly?
Absolutely. Thank you, Etienne. We are looking at ESG from a sustainable value creation perspective. So it's all about our investment teams really thinking about ESG integration. We have a target of 100% ESG integration by 2023. We do recognize this as a journey. It does take time. It requires tools, systems, and then solutions, and obviously partnership with our clients, stakeholders, and the wider society as well. So we are thinking about it in a very holistic way, and are really on this journey.
And we even heard that in the last panel, that it has to happen. But Bertie, when we look the search for alpha, we look around at the markets in the last couple of weeks. We don't have to look too far back. I sometimes wonder, are we looking for a search for survival right now? So yes, we want alpha without a doubt, but how do we look and sort of build recession-proof investment? Or is that even possible now? Keeping ESG in mind.
Keeping ESG in mind, as always. I would say this is very much a kind of long-term investment process rather than a week-by-week. Yes, of course, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen markets go through a bit of turmoil. What's really interesting for me is even in the last couple of weeks where we look at the fund flows, yes, we've seen huge amounts of fund flows out of global equities, but very, very little out of ESG funds. It's all non-ESG funds which are seeing the outflows rather than ESG funds. So we're continuing to see that proportionate contribution of ESG funds increase over the last couple of weeks.
That's very encouraging, and I think, given to see, even talk to the big players and the fund allocation people, even in our last panel too. But we have to look to the future on that. Talk to us, Oliver, if you would, about sustainable investment, and does it actually mean that, we might have to sacrifice some returns? Because I think people look at that, particularly when we're looking at climate risk and indeed, the impact on valuations in the longer term.
I think that really is the common perception that an ESG investment is not as good an investment and you're going to give up those returns. And certainly when I'm talking to my clients and about some of the transactions we're looking to structure, I think one of the first 5 questions is going to be, how many basis points will this save me? But the reality is that we've seen that it's not the case. So we looked at our own sustainable finance book, and we compared the sustainable finance sort of returns on a risk-adjusted basis and the rest of the book, and the sustainable bit was better returning. So it was actually better business for us. And I think that's kind of the trend that we're starting to see. And when you look at the long term, you think of the risks from climate coming in, that's only going to increase, particularly if you've got a sort of long 10-year plus horizon in terms of some of your kind of more infrastructure-based investments.
And I think that's so encouraging to hear. Catherine, when we look about, ESG integration and engagement, particularly, in terms of making better informed decisions, as that source of value creation. Talk to us a bit more about, the data that's helping everybody make those decisions.
Absolutely. Well, Invesco in 2021 recorded over 3,000 company engagements on ESG. So having that dialogue with companies and having that engagement with companies is really important because, this is about moving forward together. But obviously, to have an informed dialogue, you need good data. And so we created our own ESG rating system, so really an evaluation of company performance on ESG issues. And we did that because an off-the-shelf solution we felt wasn't going to give us enough insight and that holistic perspective we were really looking for, and importantly, really targeting those really material issues per company. So we're now able to drill into our companies, and that has really been driving forward that increased dialogue and engagement with companies.
And again, I think we have to look at the measurement that's out there, and we can maybe hopefully talk a little bit about that later. But Bertie, there's still a lot of challenges out there for some companies in terms of actually getting access to capital. And talk to us perhaps a little bit about, capital flows. What do companies need to really be doing?
Sure, and so I'm going to divide, if I can, between the listed companies and the unlisted companies. So for listed companies, they are, by and large, getting access to capital that they need. The equity markets are functioning, the debt capital markets are functioning. They are discriminating, as Oliver was saying, between those who are perceived to have a longer duration of growth and better kind of quote-unquote ESG potential. On the private market side, we're beginning to see development as well. So we're beginning to see the private equity firms really pivot their asset gathering exercises into the more greener side of the equation. So using kind of EU speak, the kind of Article 8 funds and Article 8 plus funds. So they are absolutely in asset gathering mode and focus there. One of the big challenges that we're facing is a lot of the really exciting projects that are coming are projects. They're big solar parks, they're big developments. And that's a challenging area to find finance for hitherto because there isn't a revenue track record. So the kind of the classic VC, private equity, crossover investor who wants a revenue track record can't point to that. But at the same time, they're going to be building this huge store of value, which will be generating revenues in kind of 5+ years' time. So how do you finance that today, where there's a lot of initial risk? And that's one of the things that we spend a lot of time thinking about, trying to make sure the various different bits match up. And I think it was mentioned on the prior panel as well, kind of a little bit of kind of demand pull, so that you can then get the supply coming through.
Oliver, when we just, following on that, some data is not available. How do we actually make decisions? Where do we get the data? How do we look at the measurement, the standardization, all of that? I mean, there's huge pressure for everybody, I think, to move forward, to move fast. We heard Noel Quinn say we might fail a bit along the way. We've got to just pick up and move again. So, how can we actually get it right? I mean, is it possible at the moment? I mean, we ultimately have to get it right, but we might make a few mistakes.
I think the data question is really important. Data for any investment is key, whether it's financial, whether it's ESG data. I work with companies in Africa and the Middle East, not necessarily the most forthcoming regions in terms of disclosure historically. And getting that data in a form that you can use is really important. And that's why I think you're going to hear more about this later, but the tool that FII has developed with the support of EY and some others of us who have been chipping in some ideas, is going to be really exciting, being able to kind of contextualize that data, to show what does good look like in a particular market, rather than sort of trying to compare a company in Africa to the baseline in Europe, which doesn't give you any meaningful comparison to actually find, what is that really important and what that sort of most positive ESG investment that you can make.
And again, I think, Catherine, let's have a look at, particularly carbon-intensive industries and, the characteristics of different asset classes. Where's the trade-off and how do we look at that when it comes to risk, return and carbon intensity?
Yeah, no, thank you. So I think, look, there recent markets have obviously shown that for particularly very thematic, very focused strategies, such as a clean tech strategy right now, has been impacted by the current market movements. What we have seen, certainly in our strategies, is that a broader perspective, so say like a sustainable emerging market fund, say, wouldn't necessarily underperform, and that is even when it's carbon optimized. So if you have a broader diversification, you can diversify while optimizing for carbon risk in a structured way, and I think we've seen some success with doing that. And for example, in one of our strategies, been able to lower the carbon footprint so that the strategy became in line with, say, a 2-degree world as opposed to previously a 4-degree world, just through carbon optimization, but with the same risk return. And that's been, really powerful, because obviously, there are many clients that don't want that trade-off, right?
And I think the body of work that's been done to actually help inform clients. Bertie, we talked in the other panel about it's not just about the environment and it's not just about climate. We're looking at S, we're looking at G. And let's take, just because it's all happening, a quick look at geopolitics and the impact on ESG, and probably something that wasn't in the rule books, and how many companies just stepped up and said, we're not doing this.
I mean, it's a fascinating question, because I think what we saw in the last 2-3 months has been ESG in real life, which is companies choosing, particularly Western companies, choosing to examine their exposure to certain countries. Are they happy with those exposures? And you saw leadership at the start where a number of companies said, actually, I want to exit Russia, Belarus. Then you saw societal and indeed consumer pressure coming through. There are a couple of automakers where they started getting action put on them, and tweets and Instagrams and all the things I don't understand to do with social media, putting pressure on the companies, and then that was changing their ways. So this is kind of real life action of, can I preserve value through values? And a lot of the decisions were being made was, actually, it's better for my standing as a company to listen to what my customers want, to listen to what I feel as a company, and exit for more reason. And actually, in many instances, is well reported at kind of significant cost to the company, but overall preserving market value in their view.
And again, it was swift action that was made, swift, loud, and I think leadership came in there. Probably what Noel talked about, taking the risk. One other area too, when we look at ESG for good, yes, we want to make money on this, but also, and I just heard the president of Angola recently say that saving the planet shouldn't bring more hunger and misery to people who continue to depend on their hydrocarbon revenue. And he came out very, very loud at a conference recently on this. Because on one side, yes, we have so much to do, but we can't then destroy societies at the same time. How do you balance that?
I think this concept of a just transition is one of the most challenging to tackle, to be honest. It's something that as an emerging market bank in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, it is core to everything that we're doing. We produced a study recently called Just in Time, and we've worked out that to get to net zero, and we're looking at net zero by 2060, not even net zero by 2050 for this, there's a $95 trillion investment gap that emerging markets need to get there. And we looked at some of the financing ways of that, and if it's self-financed through taxes and borrowing, that's going to have an impact of about 5% on consumer spending in those countries, 5% per year. And we've looked at some of the costs, and that could be as much as $2 trillion per year globally. If developed markets come in and actually support that, and they're the ones providing the funding, household consumption is going to go up 4.5%, and you're going to have an increase in global GDP of around about 3%. So you're actually seeing it being a net positive for developed markets to play that role, to support that transition in a just manner.
And I think a lot comes down to this concept of, a just transition, whereby sometimes I think sitting in London, it's very, very comfortable in many ways. People are worried about the end of the day, not the end of the world in so many societies. And I think we all have a duty, and all of you, particularly in the financial market, have a duty to that. Catherine, talk to us when we look at the concept of, real assets as, we knew them. For the most part, we look back, and even, the Industrial Revolution, everything that makes our manufacturing work, all of that too. How can one, I suppose, mix and match to a point whereby we can have a balanced, low-carbon portfolio, or do you just shy away from it?
Well, I think that's a great question, because this whole concept of net zero has come to the fore, and I do think that the kind of the focus so far has been on, say, more traditional public asset classes, listed equities and fixed income, and I think, as Bertie rightly said, I do think there's a huge opportunity in the private market, so in real assets, but also private debt, et cetera, to really influence change and be very direct. In the case of loans, partners with issuers that perhaps are distressed. For example, in one of our strategies, we were able to support a loan. Actually, as a Goldman Sachs as a partner, and this is an adaptation type issuance for a forestry solution now in the United States, but where you're seeing increased wildfires, etc. And so adapting to climate change is what's really going to be coming to the fore going forward. And so, being able to support better forestry management, better ways of adapting to climate change is really important, say in real assets, but also in the private real estate.
Now, Oliver, you mentioned a lot of focus from your bank, particularly on emerging markets. But how do you, I suppose, what's so different in terms of your approach to? Is it sort of emerging markets versus developed markets, or are you managing to do both?
I think we do manage to do both. I mean, obviously, our history as a bank, for most of these countries, we've been in there for the vast majority of the 160 years that Standard Chartered has been a separate entity. But I think, you need to realize that one size doesn't fit all, even within developed markets. And actually, you need to contextualize things. You need to look a little bit outside the box. Think of some of the things you can do on the structuring side, bringing in carbon credits and monetizing those, for example, looking at blended finance, export credit agency cover, some of the sort of more kind of philanthropic development capital, and bringing that in to play a role is really important in emerging markets to change the risk perspective, so that I can get a maybe less emerging markets focused bank to come in and play a more significant role in those transactions, because it starts to stack up something that might be more familiar to look at.
Talk to me a little bit, Bertie, about the role of government. And we just heard that there should be more role. Should they be? Can they be? An encourager? And they should be. But is there a danger that they can also be a hindrance? Where's the sweet spot for government?
Wow, that's quite a big question. So. We've had a lot of leadership in Europe already in terms of regulatory push. I would also say that in Europe we've had a lot of pull from the asset managers as well as corporates wanting to do it. In the US that's been less, so we're now beginning to see some push coming through. There needs to be a balance, because over-regulation typically then stifles innovation, stifles capital flows. The fascinating thing for me, though, is just been, I guess if you go back 2 years into COVID and to today. So we've gone from a period where, particularly in the Western economies, has been historically a kind of resistance to big government making big changes. Now, COVID just blew that out of the water. So you had lockdowns, you had people being mandated. Now
and they took swift action, and there was a little opposition maybe, but for the most part, no.
For the most part, no. And now we're seeing, even post the Russia-Ukraine situation, big changes getting made and being accepted in terms of energy policy, LNG policy. Things which would typically take 10 years are happening in weeks now. Now that is a massive shift in the last couple of months, which I think is going to really help the energy transition move forward at pace.
And again, it should be encouraging to make sure that people come on board. Yeah. I think, the decisions that are going to be made will be long-term, but again, making sure that everybody can do something practical. I think, they've really looked maybe a little bit better. Catherine, again, staying with, emerging markets, developed markets, and perhaps, could you give us maybe an example of some of the work that you've been looking at in emerging markets that's perhaps different in terms of how you work?
Well, I mean, I would say in India, for example, we were one of the first to launch an ESG fund. So we have with our Indian team very exciting, based on our proprietary research methodology and insight that the India team provides. We were one of the first to actually do an ESG fund there. I think since actually the policymakers have seen increased interest in India in terms of ESG issues, disclosure, stewardship, etc., has come to the fore in that market specifically, which is, I think an illustration of what we're seeing more broadly in emerging markets, actually a really strong interest in, both setting the framework and then providing the actual specific solutions. And we're a partner in that. We want to play in that. And so, seeing significant opportunities there.
Oliver, how can financial institutes, I suppose, get more creative? And perhaps creativity wasn't a word we might associate with financial institutions. But again, since things are shifting at such a rate, how do you catch up with that and make sure that there is more flexibility to make sure the funds are there?
I think there's a lot of potential for that. I mean, we as a bank, we structured the first social loan in Africa for the Republic of Ghana, talking about just transition. That was financing a road project that was going to connect rural communities into the major cities. Not necessarily the most green investment from a social point of view, really, really impactful. The thing that I'm most excited about, though, is when you bring in that sort of monetization of carbon credits, which I mentioned briefly earlier. We've started to incorporate that into a few things. We did something with Etihad Airways back in 2020, which was a sustainability-linked bond, or sukuk even, where instead of the investors getting more, actually the company said, we're going to go out and purchase carbon credits. But we're also looking at things where projects are going to generate a carbon credit or an amount of carbon credits. You sell those to investors, to other companies, and use that to reduce the interest burden that companies are going to pay. And for sovereigns, in particular in Africa, where there's such a focus at the moment on that debt burden and on the sort of the crisis there, and we see it in Sri Lanka most recently, of course, that actually, if you can use that and bring around sort of a new source of revenue that's going to be funding that interest payment, your interest burden looks very different and hopefully frees up some capital from the sort of traditional income streams of the government to then go into other areas and support kind of other important steps that they need to take.
We have so many areas that we're not going to be able to delve into in this panel, but throughout the day, I mean, I think we have just about everything covered. I'm very excited about what we're going to talk about. But wrapping this up one, Catherine, in terms of perhaps, that words of wisdom, words of warning out there, there's so much happening, it's happening so quick. Leave us with an inspiring thought for the day.
Thank you. Well, I think for me, where I'm seeing the market growing is really around action. Like, take action. This is hard. There are lots of complexities. There are lots of questions, I think, in everyone's mind. But I think if we keep questioning, keep asking for more information, now education is important, but I think just taking the small steps to make the first inroads teaches everyone a lot, and not be afraid to fail, right? Just take action and get on the journey.
Oliver, again, creativity is needed, risk is needed, bravery, leadership, all of that. A sort of call to action to the industry. What can we do? And what can we do practically, before the year is out, perhaps?
I think COP26 in Glasgow last year was great. We saw a lot of statements from the developed markets saying we're going to support emerging markets, particularly Africa. We saw a lot of talk. The action hasn't yet followed, and action, I think, really, really is key. We have a great opportunity with COP later in the year in Egypt, in Africa for the very first time, to drive that forwards and to actually see tangible commitments, and not just saying we're going to allocate this amount of capital. And that's the public sector and the private sector as well. We need to do that too. But start showing that you're taking steps, you're deploying into these projects. And there are so many projects. There are so many great companies that are not, the projects, as Bertie was mentioning, but the companies are doing lots of different small things that are really exciting and facilitating the ecosystem. And that's what we need to be supporting and actually delivering on those commitments.
Bertie, I'm going to leave you the closing word on this one. So a little pressure on it there. Again, we have a good few months left in this year and a good few months till we, get ready for COP. What do we need to be doing?
Well, if I may, Ethne, I'm going to do something relatively dangerous, which is disagree with one of your previous statements on the prior panel, where you said it was win-win. It's not win-win.
You don't think it can be?
No, there will be losers if you're not adapting your company. If you're not moving quickly, you'll be out-competed. And so you should think about this not as a box-ticking exercise you need to do. This is a survival exercise as well as a thriving exercise. If you don't get it right, then there will be some casualties along the road. So think about it through that lens. This is a commercial imperative for you to adapt.
And are you encouraged that people are heading that direction, or are you
Yes.
concerned that maybe there's a few that aren't doing it fast enough and think, oh, maybe later, or maybe a diluted version?
I come from a bank where it's a culture of you can never do enough. There's always continual improvement. So I think that some companies are doing fantastically, but there's always more to do.
Okay, and again, that call for action, I think, will be heard loud and clear, particularly after we get through the day and keep everybody, engaged, informed, educated, and hopefully inspire you all throughout the day. Thank you all so much. Catherine, thank you for being with us. Oliver, Bertie, thank you so much. A big round of applause for my great team here.
Thank you.
It's been super. Thank you so much.
Edna, what a great start to the day.
Good to have you back. I think we have the action people on the panel. They're here. They're committed, and I think they're also sending out a few warning signs.
Tell me, what was your takeaway?
I just am so encouraged that the narrative has shifted. Remember, not that long ago, it was very difficult to get the CEO of a bank and fund managers up there to talk about this. Whereby now, I think the reality of the decarbonisation message is out there, the opportunities that are there within this. And I just think we've stood back and looked at that great direction we're all heading in and say, actually, we need to look at the journey a little bit more.
Fantastic. We have definitely come a long way since my days in banking, sitting on the trading floor of UBS when I was one of the few women. And on that note, I'm particularly pleased with the composition of my next panel, as you'll see in a moment, Edna.
And I think many, many people mentioned it there, the ESGs, we'll make sure the SDGs are put in place. And,
exactly.
It's something new, perhaps, if we look back on pictures of a financial conference 5 years ago. Probably your panel looks a little bit different than things.
Exactly. Let's bring them up now. Thank you so much, Edna. Right, we're going to move now from the shift to look at the shift in financial institutions' strategy of how they approach ESG investing. Let's bring up my panel. I will introduce them to you as they come up. Welcome. Welcome. Thank you so much. Come on, let's give them a round of applause. Welcome. Well, I'd just like to note one more time, composition of this panel, looking pretty fantastic, isn't it?
It is.
So we know that lower and middle income countries have been penalized by investors avoiding certain investments. As we shift to a more proactive approach, engaging with portfolio companies to impact change, we're going to ask what effect this approach is having in emerging markets. So with me now to discuss moving from divestment to engagement, very pleased
but actually,
to have
I was more saying it can be
on
win-win
stage.
for
Got
the developing
Edna
world
in the background there, but we've very pleased to
No,
have
but Bernie, I
Brania
love the way you
Nashar,
brought that
Head of
up because
Compliance
absolutely,
and Governance
and
Divisions,
that was good to actually say
Saudi
it
Arabia's
directly, otherwise
Public
you'd be out.
Investment Fund. Also the CEO of London Stock Exchange, Julia Hoggett, thanks for coming along. Very pleased to have from BNY Mellon, Corinne Neal. We have Global Head of ESG from PGIM, Eugenia Jackson, and Head of Social Impact at SoftBank, Catherine Lenson. So let's kick off briefly, if you will, from where you sit. How does this transition from divestment to engagement in ESG investing, how's it going? And I'd love to hear one challenge and one opportunity. Corinne, let's start with you.
Well, biggest challenge, I guess, to make decisions is to obtain the right data And there is both too much data available. It's not using the same definition, so it's very difficult to navigate through it. And the investors don't really trust what is available in the market. So that's the biggest challenge. Biggest opportunity is to leverage on technology to navigate through this data and to align it to investors' specific own goals. And we have the technology today to be able to achieve this, so that's the good news.
Tell us a little bit more about that technology. What does it enable you to do?
For instance, at bعنوان, we use natural language processing to navigate through 600 different data sources that are chosen by investors to help them align their own definition of sustainability with their own goals, with the data that is available in the market. And very often the data is also collected by investors themselves through engagement, which leads us to today's discussion.
All right, excellent. Catherine, what about you? Where do you sit in this? How do you see this transition from divestment to engagement?
Yeah, so for us, the challenge and the opportunity are really one and the same. And at SoftBank, we invest in technology companies with radical ideas about how they want to transform the world. And for us, the challenge is about making sure that for us and for the industry in general, we're able to put investment dollars into the hands of diverse founders. Diverse meaning women, diverse meaning otherwise underrepresented in the location that they're founding companies in. And so for us, that's a challenge because if you look at the data, something like 2% of venture funding in Europe, for example, goes to women. Something like 1.6% last year went to non-white founders.
Still.
Staggeringly awful numbers.
Right.
It's a challenge. It's also an opportunity because we know that these companies and these founders represent real investment opportunities. They're building products, they're building technology that the market wants, that consumers want. We'll soon have a situation where the US is a majority-minority country, and yet still the technology that we use that shapes our everyday is being built by founders and funded into companies that, for the most part, don't look like the people who are consuming the technology. That's a unique opportunity commercially.
So what percentage of the companies you put money towards are run by non-white, non-male leaders?
So we have two different approaches to this. And in our late stage fund, the Vision Fund, we're very focused on making sure that we do focus on that. However, we're also trying to influence funding at the earliest stages of the capital cycle. Because by the time you get to a growth stage fund like the Vision Fund, you need the system to have done its work at every point of the funding cycle to be able to write the growth stage checks. And so we're very proud of the work that we're doing at the earliest stages of the capital cycle through a couple of funds, the Opportunity Fund in the US, Emerge in Europe, which really are about fixing the issue at the earliest stages and getting that capital into the hands of diverse founders, and then following them through their journey so that they can go on and become Vision Fund companies. And that's our aspiration.
Fascinating. Let's hear from Rania. Tell me where you see this, the conversation from the view of the PIF in terms of divestment versus engagement.
PIF really understands that being engaged with its portfolio companies and investment is the right thing to be done. It's not about divestment, and because divestment will not help the overall economy. You're just moving the investments from the hands of the public to more private hands where there's no transparency, no monitoring, and this will not help the overall economy. So what we look at is more of not only the destination, but the journey. Companies, including PIF portfolio companies, are announcing their net emission reduction, that we're doing the right decision the first time, because action on climate change cannot be overstated, but we should also not ignore the consequences of these decisions on the economy, on the social, and on the financial part. So that's why we approach the ESG through multiple aspects, through partnership, through creating the right platforms, and sponsoring initiatives and events. So as part of the creating the platforms, PIF has just announced the Voluntary carbon market for the whole MENA region, where we are trying to bring in investors and institutions toward helping them to achieve their carbon reduction targets. Also, what we have done in partnership, PIF is one of the founders of the One Planet Sovereign Wealth Funds steering group, which is a network of multiple sovereign wealth funds, asset managers, and private equity that holds assets of more than $30 trillion. We are working together and collaborating in understanding the risk and the challenges and the opportunities for the climate change. Also, as part of being the investment arm for the Saudi government and one of the main economic catalysts to achieve the Vision 2030 targets, we are supporting all the initiatives locally, regionally, and globally, such as the Saudi Green Initiative and the MENA Green Initiative.
A lot of going on in there, and a lot of complexity, which we might come back to. Interesting, you mentioned the voluntary carbon market as well. Julia might touch on that in a moment. Yeah. Before I come to you, Julia, though, I want to get Eugenia in. Let's come back to the title of this talk, and it's about divestment versus engagement. Rishi Kapoor from Investcorp said earlier today, exclusion is a blunt instrument. So is there really no role for exclusion anymore, Eugenia?
Thank you so much, Edie. And I would just say, before I move straight into the topic, is that at PGIM we invest across all major asset classes, in private and public markets. And when it comes to this proactive shift to proactive ESG approach, the real change that we've seen over the last couple of years is our investors, our clients, are interested in achieving positive environmental and social impacts on top of achieving financial returns. So the discourse has moved from is it ESG versus financial performance to how we can use, so how can we achieve the desired financial returns whilst also maximizing the positive environmental and social impact. I think this is a very, very important move. And coming to the question, is there a role for exclusions? I would say that, first of all, if we look at the ESG strategies out there in the market, we will see that actually exclusionary approaches are still very, very dominant. So it's there. Now, why is it there? Firstly, exclusions do allow our underlying investors, our clients, to express their values and their sustainability preferences through their investments. It is a blunt tool, but it can be effective if you want to channel your particular values through those exclusions. The second reason for non-investment, let me put it this way, is also part of risk management, because some of our clients do see the role of exclusions as, for example, giving them ability to consistently manage certain risks, such as climate transition risk. But when you come to divestment versus engagement, I think for an active manager, both are very useful tools. Because engagement, of course, is going to be a preferred option for the vast majority of investors. Because if you have a good engagement, if you achieve the positive change that your engagement was meant to achieve, and if that positive change also increases the value of your investment, well, that's a win-win. That's actually a perfect situation. But to be able to achieve that, you need a certain alignment, right? You need to have the engagement objective needs to be aligned between the issuer and the investor, so both needs to be on the same page in terms of what they need to achieve. Also, importantly, the time frame for making progress towards that objective also needs to be aligned. When you see that there is a misalignment, so investors maybe want too much or want too fast, or the issuer is not willing to commit quite to the same point, you have to start considering what are the options. Because for an investor, ultimately, for an asset manager, we have our clients. We have fiduciary duty to our clients. They have their own underlying objectives, and we have to deliver on those objectives, both from the financial returns perspective and from the ESG perspective. So if we are seeing that either, on the risk management side, we are not getting there, we are not mitigating risk sufficiently, then why would we stay as an active manager in that investment? And finally, if on the ESG objective side, if we are not achieving our clients' ESG objectives, then, again, exit is, or non-investment is something that, we should be able to use. So I would say there is still a role.
Okay, so it's complex. It's not black and white. That's what I'm getting here. Julia, tell us what role stock exchanges have to play on the path to net zero.
I'd say it's huge. I'm a former regulator, and I think I said at FII in Riyadh last year, you'd expect me to believe in pipes and plumbing, but I genuinely do. And I think a lot of it is about how we make sure that all the pipes and plumbing in the system actually direct flows in the way that they need to to go. And I talk about it that money may make the world go round, but data shows it where to go. And this point was made that we don't yet have the right structures around all the data that we need. So we think about it through, I'd say, 3 or 4 lenses. One is financing the green economy. The other is financing the transition and being really outspoken about our role to finance the transition as well as the green economy.
And that means engagement.
And that means engagement. And I talk very publicly, to steal from Gil Scott-Heron, about the concept that the transition must be televised. In other words, we actually need to have this conversation out loud in public, and we need to be measuring this progress that we make. And the public markets are a superb place to do that, and therefore the public market should be the last place that is saying that the transition should be happening elsewhere. The next piece is that we need to make sure that we have the data and the rule sets to support that. I think COP26 went a long way to producing rule sets that are much more standardized, but there is still further that we need to go, and there's more trust in the data that needs to be generated. I think that is absolutely right. The final piece is actually advocacy. We do set rules, and we can also influence and try to support how rules are set around the world, but we can speak out as well. So we can actually, and one of the things I feel very passionately about, is making sure that we speak out for the complexity of this discussion and recognize that actually a lot of the things that we're deploying today, we may find in 2 or 3 years' time are not the optimal solutions to get us to net zero. We will make lots of mistakes. If this was easy, we'd have done it. And therefore, we can't reduce this to binary yes-nos and to tweets. We actually have to have a system that recognizes the complexity. And calling that out and being an advocate for the complexity, I think, is an important thing to do. And it doesn't just apply to climate transition. I think we feel the same duty when it comes to representation of diverse communities as well. And obviously, the rule sets in the UK are increasingly focused on that in terms of expectations around representation of listed companies. And as a female CEO of the London Stock Exchange, you would expect me to think that we shouldn't just have International Women's Day, we should just have every single day of the year.
Hear, hear.
And advocate for that representation and the importance of it, but also the value of it. So to me, the most powerful thing we can do is not only create the change, but be a voice and a beacon to advocate for it, because it's possibly easier for us as a convener sometimes to be outspoken than it is for other parts of the community.
You mentioned too complex to be done in a tweet. I think quite a lot of things are too complex for 360 characters or whatever it is. Let's focus on what else you might need to apply ESG metrics, Corinne. What do you need in order to play a more active role?
So it starts by defining goals. That's really important. Not everybody has the same goals. And actually, we realized that at BNY Mellon by asking our clients, because we have clients all over the world, in the Middle East, in emerging markets, in EMEA, everywhere. And they each have different sets of goals. There's always a combination of financial performance in it. There is some element of risk. There might be other financial elements like maturity, duration, but there's also values, and values are very specific to individuals. So the first thing is to help investors express their goals, because if you have that, you can better align capital flows to the goals of investors. So the first most important thing that is missing today in the markets is that alignment and helping investors express those goals. As I was saying earlier, now we have technology. We can actually pick up information from individual preferences and match them to investments. And actually in EMEA, the regulators are moving in that direction. They're saying you have ultimately to make sure that your products meet the goals of the investors. That's exactly what they mean. And so you need to find a way to simplify the process, because it can be overwhelming to match the investments and investors. And that will bring more investments in emerging markets. So that's a really critical element that is currently missing.
Anything to build on that, Eugenia?
I would say yes, certainly. And I totally agree with what Corinne just said. But I also think that to be able to live in this world where we have very different, diverse goals and ESG objectives, and we as asset managers have to fulfill those different objectives, but to make it understandable to the outside world, to help investors, particularly retail investors, to make informed choices, we need a much more agreement on the definitions of ESG. So when we say ESG, when we say sustainability, when we say impact, what do we actually mean? We need some consensus around the taxonomy, the naming convention, the taxonomy around products. And some of the regulators are doing it. We know SFDR in Europe, but it's not resolving it yet. We're only only realizing just how much confusion we have in this market. So I think that's an essential step. And the second I would mention, going back to the regulation, we do need a well thought through regulation in this space. We need a regulation that is paced at the right and sequenced, very importantly, sequenced in the right way. So first we go for disclosures from corporates, then it comes to investment managers, how we collect that information, how we translate it into analytical tools, into sort of creating different solutions, focusing on different investment objectives of our clients, and then sort of going to asset owners where they can then present what they've been doing at their holistic portfolio level to their underlying investors. I think that's what we need to be a lot more active in this space.
You mentioned the different words in the taxonomy, and I think that's so important because what we've seen over the last few years is actually all these different conversations that used to happen in silos converging: CSR, diversity and inclusion, SDGs, equality, growth, and now they come together, and sometimes it can be quite difficult. Catherine, what do you think the key drivers are behind responsible investment decisions?
I think what you just said is so interesting and really important to dig into for a moment, because the different acronyms, and my word, are we acronym heavy in this space, but the different acronyms actually sometimes are getting at slightly different angles. So CSR is, traditionally about a corporate doing the right thing. It's about charity and philanthropy, and it's often about giving away money. And I think what sometimes we get wrong when we talk about the ESG space, and for us this is very important when we think about our two impact-focused funds, so the Opportunity Funds and Emerge, it's really important that we talk about these as the unique commercial opportunities that they are. This is not a CSR project. I spent the early part of my career thinking about diversity from a people lens. This is equally as important from an investment lens as it was 10 years ago and continues to be now on the people side. This is about diverse teams producing better commercial results. This is about diverse founders building products that better serve a diverse consumer base. And so, depending on who I'm talking to, I tend to come at this from one of two angles. Of course, there's a social angle. Of course, it does the right thing. Of course, we want our children to grow up in a world where products are being built that serves them. We talked a moment ago about gender. Let's talk about gender for a moment. Why are so many women's health tech products that come on the market, or so many health tech products, not focused on women's health? Facial recognition, for an example, gets white men's faces right 100% of the time. Typically gets non-white women's faces wrong 35% of the time. Extraordinary gaps. So, of course, there's a social angle. Of course, we want to do the right thing. But to another audience, this is a unique commercial opportunity. There are opportunities to make significant money in this market, and by the way, it has the byproduct of doing the right thing at the same time. Why would we not do that? It's win-win from every possible angle.
It's not just facial recognition, it's vocal recognition. Actually, for my podcast, my co-host is Hispanic, and I can't even tell you sometimes when I read the transcripts the words that it's changed her words into. Rana, you've spoken about the need for governance to really drive climate action. So tell us about how the PIF in particular is implementing its governance structure in order to serve its ESG integration plan.
Actually, it all starts with the G, with governance. Once you have the governance right, then the S and the E part will naturally come. So the governance means that we have to really understand how our investments, how our companies that we own are taking the right decision first time. So it starts with the board, with its committee, and ensuring that our investment teams are heavily and continuously engaged with those companies to understand the risks and opportunities that relate to all matters, including ESG, and ensure how this is embedded within the companies. As we all are saying here, that there is the challenge of the definitions, of the taxonomies, of doing the right thing, of setting the goals, how to pace the ESG within the portfolio companies. So that's why we have created the platform for the overall ESG, where we monitor and ensure that our companies are reporting to us on their ESG goals. it's very key in our investment decision process that ESG is looked into as part of all our investments, because here we are talking about the future. We are not talking about de-risking or decarbonization of our portfolios now. It's about, the future. So how we help in the transition, how we create the right awareness. Once you do divestment, it helps in the creating the awareness, but it does not help in the overall impact that PIF is sought to have. So therefore, we make sure that the decision-making process, ensuring the right votes and the right board seats, we secure in the companies to help in driving and influencing the decision.
Interesting. So, Julie, let's come back to the topic of today. It's really all about getting money to emerging economies. What role does the LSE have to play in moving capital from high-income countries to lower and middle-income countries?
The London Stock Exchange has traditionally been the most global stock exchange in terms of financing emerging market economies, and that aspiration is not going to change, certainly not under my watch. But fundamentally, the other thing is we need to start doing things differently. That sort of comment attributed to Einstein that he never said that actually that sign of madness is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. Some of the things we need to do is think about how we actually change the way capital flows and what we value. The transition to net zero means that companies in the global north have a massive need to have the tools by which they can get to net zero. The voluntary carbon markets provide a great opportunity there. For those who are unfamiliar with the voluntary carbon markets, you can't have a voluntary carbon credit unless you're doing an investment in reducing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere that is genuinely additive. So building a wind farm off the North Sea with a viable offtake price doesn't get you a carbon credit. And therefore, all of this activity is stuff that would not otherwise happen that will get us and contribute to getting us to net zero. We have focused at the London Stock Exchange on building a voluntary carbon market to finance those projects, not to trade the actual credits. There are lots of other people who want to do that, but to actually direct the financing into those projects. It will enable funds to be created that can pay dividends as cash, but actually dividends in specie as voluntary carbon credits. In the UK, we now have mandatory TCFD, so all the listed companies have to disclose to that standard. And as David was saying this morning, we want to get to a point where there's mandatory transition plans by 2023. And therefore, you can have a grown-up conversation about what the hard yards are that companies are actually doing to decarbonize their supply chains and their production, and then that bit that they can't yet solve for. If you produce shampoo, and your Scope 3 emissions include the amount of energy that we all use when we have a shower in the morning. And you're
Scope 3 meaning the things that you aren't under your direct control.
Exactly. Yep. And you don't control the fact that the energy is produced in coal-fired power plants, then that isn't something you're going to be able to directly impact yet. But you could invest in carbon credits to address that piece of your emission target. And therefore, it's an illustration of how much we can actually think about shifting what is valued and therefore where cash flows. A huge amount of the projects where that sequestration will take place will be in low and middle income countries. One of the things that really personally matters to me as a former development sociologist is actually that we maximize the returns to the global south of those projects. If we nickel and dime and compete on price, on the carbon price, the people who will benefit will be the global north. The people who will lose out will be the global south. And so it's a really interesting inflection point in the design of the carbon markets as to how we do this. But our view is that our primary job is to direct capital into those projects to make sure that we actually get to net zero. And that is, as I say, doing something very different. It's not a market that we've traditionally had, but it is part of how we get to what my aspiration is for London Stock Exchange, which, as my colleagues describe it, is 8 letters, Julia, but really difficult, which is this concept of ESG as BAU. At the moment, an awful lot of flows into the green economy and into the transition are bifurcated. They're small subsets of the total flows that go on in the market. Actually, we should get to a point where everybody can evaluate every asset through that lens.
Okay.
And that's the ultimate aspiration that we have at the Stock Exchange.
Running very short of time. We've got to get to what happened to Tesla, Corinne. Pioneer in electric vehicles, getting dropped from the S&P ESG rankings, leaving ExxonMobil. Tell us why.
Thank you for giving me the trick question. I think you answered it at the beginning, actually, because the world of ESG is not black and white. It's shades of gray, and it means you really need to have all of the information underneath those decisions. And there are many aspects of E, of S, and G that will have been combined. And actually, it's more than one metric for each of those categories. And for some aspects of the categories, maybe Tesla did better, and for some aspects of the categories, they didn't. And as a result of that, whoever combined all of those together based on their own methodology decided that the ranking was against them. It's important also to realize that very often decisions are made as a function of the construction of a methodology or an index. There are certain categories of industries that have to be part of an index. As a result of that, you have to find a candidate, although it might be subject to questioning. So this is simply a matter of finding the right underlying information to support the decisions. And under that lens, you can explain the decision.
All right, thank you. Very quickly, portfolio performance. How's it going, Catherine?
So I think here we come back to what we've been talking about. These assets are truly investable. And we, in our opportunity funds, we see some very, very strong performance. We see companies that we've invested in that have gone on to raise capital from some of the top names in the venture world. We see exits. We see really strong product development. And I think that's exciting because I think the more we see that, the more we see the broader investment world outside of pure impact funds looking at those. That's ESG as BAU. That's how it should be.
Perfect. I'm going to give the last word to Rania. One thing you want more from governments to encourage this money to flow to emerging markets.
Incentives have to be created to help companies, whether public or private, toward the transitioning, as well as we want a real transparency and monitoring to ensure that there's no greenwash, no pinkwash, no any other wash. So the incentives, the disclosures, and the monitoring.
Don't wash your reds with your whites there. All right. Thank you very much to my fantastic panel. Let's give them a huge round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. We're ticking right along here, and I'm very pleased to welcome to the stage now the Chief Growth Officer from BNY Mellon, Akash Shah, because we have all been inspired by the actions and the words coming from young people with regards to the climate emergency, speaking about equality, poverty. So we're going to hear from them now. So Akash, the stage is yours.
Oh, good to see you. Well, I want to start off with a caveat. I am not meant to represent young people. I'm here merely to moderate this session. I think it was a cruel joke from our partners at FII to put me with some exceptional Gen Z next generation leaders whom are going to join us on stage very soon. But I'm going to keep my remarks very brief just to say how important it is when we talk about generational change that we think about really developing the next generation of leaders and bringing all of our capabilities as a society, whether it's our education, our experience, our capital, to really fund and fuel this next generation. And what we're going to hear today is 4 exceptional panelists, leaders in their early 20s who are already building great institutions that are changing the world in the climate transition, in financial inclusion, in broader diversity and inclusion, and bringing all the tools that, frankly, maybe we haven't seen before, music and technology and collaboration at a scale that's quite extraordinary. So I'm really, really excited that we're going to have this panel up. We're going to start off with actually one of our panelists, A.Y. Young. He is a youth leader in the Sustainability Development Goals of the UN and founder of Project 17. We're going to start with a quick video from A.Y. Over to the video.
a local hip-hop artist makes an international name for himself. He is the first artist to power his concert with 100% renewable energy.
It is a real honor to recognize Mr. A.Y. Young, the founder of Battery Tour.
It's incredible. Can't wait for you to see this. The United Nations is now throwing its support behind him.
Mr. Young has made a big impact in his young life, born in 1991. He's a singer-songwriter, a dancer, producer, entrepreneur, and sustainability advocate. He's staged and performed more than 800 concerts. He was named by the United Nations recently as one of 17 youth world leaders of the